Good evening, everyone, and good morning to our guests. Welcome to our Zoom event tonight. We are honored to have as our guest speaker today, Brian Stelter, joining us from New York. Many of you may already know him, watch his shows, follow his massive Twitter account, or subscribe to his nightly newsletter. Mr. Stelter impressively came to prominence while he was still a university student, when at 18, he was already capturing the attention of TV industry titans and veterans with his must-read blog, TV Newser. From there, he became a New York Times reporter covering the media industry. Today, he is CNN Worldwide's chief media correspondent, and he anchors reliable sources every Sunday, delving into how the media affect the stories they cover. He has written 2 books, Top of the Morning, about the cutthroat world of morning television, and most recently, Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. Now here to lead the conversation with Mr. Stelter is Eric Richard, former editor-in-chief of Agence France Presse, who's now responsible for special editorial projects. He is the first vice president of the FCC and convener of the club's Press Freedom Committee. I take you to Eric.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
Thanks for
Or good evening to all of you. Good morning for me. I have my coffee. Hopefully some of you have something stronger.
We'll work on that later. So first of all, I mean, congratulations on the book. I mean, there's been a lot of books about Trump and the Trump era, but this seems to have shot up the bestseller lists. So I would like to start by asking you about the title Hoax. Why did you call it Hoax? And also, Hoax seems to have become one of Donald Trump's favorite terms alongside fake news.
It sure is. He used it again a few hours ago, dismissing something as a hoax. You know, the president started off saying fake news when he was elected and twisting that term, which used to mean actually fake stories that were spreading on the internet. And he used it to mean stories he doesn't like. And then I think the effect of fake news started to wear off. So he graduated to a more extreme term, like hoax. You know, the word hoax can mean that someone's trying to hurt you. It's very malicious. It's very nasty. And he uses it about once a day now to disparage things he doesn't like. So I called this book Hoax because of the way he used the word in relation to the pandemic, when he was complaining about Democrats and saying they were trying to commit a hoax. But by doing that, he was downplaying the disease, downplaying the threat of the pandemic. And that's what a lot of stars at Fox did in different ways as well. I think the book is doing well because this is the part of the Trump story that still is not fully understood, which is his addiction to Fox News. I would argue to you it's a uniquely American problem to have a president so obsessed with a television channel. But of course, there are versions of this all around the world of actually state-run TV. In the United States, instead, it is state-supported TV, and we can get into all the differences.
And actually, we're going to have questions from viewers. And just following on from that, we've got a question. I'll put it in now from John Resnick saying, by invoking the word hoax, Trump distracts, diminishes, denies, and destroys any arguments made against him. How can the mainstream media overcome this ploy, as he calls it, a subversive ploy? How can you come back against when he's calling things hoaxes?
I think to report what is true and to show that we know it's true, to be as transparent as possible, and to show people for themselves the primary sources and the on-the-record interviews and all the materials we have to show that the moon is round and that the earth is not flat and that the sky is blue. You know, and I say that in the same way that scientists try to provide proof. We have to back up our claims and our assertions with evidence, and that can be a problem sometimes when stories are anonymously sourced. I had that problem with my book because most staffers at Fox News only want to speak anonymously. But I backed up their accounts with on-the-record sources, reporters and former producers who had left, and quoting them on the record, showing they are saying the same things as the people that are there. So I think that's one small way to try to help with this, but it's a huge problem. I mean, I guess I view it this way from my perch in New York. Most Americans see through the president's hoax lies. Most Americans see through the lies, but a substantial minority embrace it and either know he's lying and don't care, or don't believe he's lying. And that's going to have long-term consequences. Well, after the Trump years, this form of lying in politics in America is going to have long-term consequences.
I mean, the subtitle was Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of the Truth. How do you define the truth?
Whoa.
When we talk about post-truth, how does Brian Stelter define the truth? What is the truth?
I like the way Carl Bernstein says it, and he says it on my program on CNN from time to time. He says we should seek the best obtainable version of the truth. And that's a slight distinction, of course, that daily news coverage is not going to be perfect. But if we can aim for the most obtainable version of the truth, then we are doing our jobs. I suppose when it comes to something like the fires in California, it's impossible to know all of the causes and all of the root reasons and all of the damage on any given day. It'll take weeks or months or years to determine. But if we can get around it as fully as possible, then we're doing our job. Then there are other, I think, basics about politics and about government that we can know right away. And we should be clear about those. Just the other day, President Trump said he's going to make sure that the military newspaper Stars and Stripes will be funded, even though there was talk in his government of defunding it. Well, that's not his call. That's the Senate's call. We know how the legislative process works in the United States. So we can just simply say that is not his decision to make, and that he would have to take extraordinary measures to maneuver. So when it comes to those basic truths, I think we should remember that the audience, the average news consumer anywhere in the world, is not as addicted to these stories as we are. We should try to start from the beginning of the story, not the middle of the story, and explain the basics of how it works. Not in a way that talks down to people, but in a way that catches them up. I was thinking about this the other day when I was covering local television, and why is it that on local TV stations in America, you can run ads full of lies and there's nothing anyone can do about it? Well, it's because of rules that the federal government has approved. And so I just put up all the rules on screen, like read from the rules aloud. And I got emails from viewers saying that was really wonky, that was really nerdy, I'm glad you did that. I think maybe we need a little bit more of that in media, where we just, we start at the beginning of the story and try to tell you the basics of why it works the way it does, or more importantly, why things don't work. Because a lot of news is about what's not working, and sadly, there's a lot to cover.
In July, I watched, I think you said it on Reliable Sources, that we're facing a truth emergency. I think that was in the context of COVID-19. Could you expand on that?
The reason I said truth emergency, I'm always trying to come up with ways to convey what we're living through right now, because it's such an upside down time in American politics. And we see versions of this around the world as well, that there are these attempts to destroy a common understanding of what's going on, to destroy a common truth. And unfortunately, in the Trump years, it started with the stupidest story, the crowd size story, which we all remember. I put an entire chapter in Hoax about the crowd size debacle because it was caused by Trump watching TV. He was watching CNN. We pointed out that the crowd wasn't as big as Obama's crowd. Trump got really angry. It ruined his whole first day of his presidency. And he went over to Fox for comfort and affirmation. And Fox became, on that very first day of his presidency, his safe space, which it has been ever since. But even something as silly as crowd size gate does speak to this attempt to destroy our common understanding of truth. And it's happened, obviously, since then in many more severe ways. So I do think it's an emergency. And hopefully in the framing of things through monologues and essays and columns, journalists can give a sense of the stakes here. Like I said, most people do see through it, but not everyone does.
I mean, the crowd size was one thing, COVID-19 something else. And a previous guest here was Kristen Urquiza. I don't know if you've spoken to her. Her father died of COVID-19 in Arizona, and she started a campaign called Marked by COVID. And she actually spoke at the Democratic convention. And I mean, she said that she blamed the Arizona governor for saying it was safe to go out. Her father was an avid viewer of Fox News and Trump. She says they have blood in their hands, Trump and Fox News, because of the deaths from COVID-19, because of what was the way it's been portrayed. What would you say to that?
I would start by saying there's a lot of blame to go around and a lot of responsibility. Mayors and governors and other media outlets and health experts and all of this. But President Trump had the biggest megaphone of all. He had the biggest stage of all. He's the loudest voice in every room. And Fox News is the most popular cable television channel in America by far. So it had the largest platform in some ways. So they have more responsibility for what went wrong than others do, just by sheer size. The way I sometimes describe cable news these days is CNN is the most, I would argue, the most important of the news outlets because it's got this worldwide reach and these bureaus and this huge journalistic institution. But Fox News is more influential within the government because Trump is addicted and so are some of his aides. And so what is said on Fox has huge importance, even though they don't have bureaus and they don't have a single bureau in China. They're not in Hong Kong. They're not anywhere in Asia, which is shocking. Instead of covering the news, they talk about the news. So in the case of the pandemic, instead of going live to Beijing, they were going live to a boat where Steve Bannon was complaining about China. And of course, now Bannon's been indicted, but on other matters. But my point is, Fox does something different than, they do have some reporters, but their news muscles are pretty weak. Their propaganda muscles are really strong. So, they talk about the news. And when they talked about the pandemic in January and February and early March, a lot of the coverage was dismissive, was downplaying. It was even a little bit of denialism, but it was mostly downplaying of the disease. And when I say that, Fox executives will say this back to me. They will say, what about our doctor who said X? What about our reporter who said Y? And that's absolutely true. There are absolutely exceptions to this. Even Sean Hannity sometimes said the right things to be serious about this. But I went back and redid the timeline for those 3 months and watched a lot of TV and looked at a lot of Trump tweets. And everything lines up pretty perfectly. They were both, the overarching message was, the Democrats are taking this too seriously. They're freaking people out. Don't buy into the hysteria. Don't be freaked out. It's going to be okay. There was this kind of complacency from both Fox and Trump. So blood on their hands, I'm not going to say that myself. I'm going to refer you in the book to the letters from people across the country who wrote to the government and said, Sean Hannity is putting my dad in danger. These shows are putting my mom in danger, because there has been a lot of that point of view. And Fox knows it, and they have been very concerned about this. And they've been trying to show that they are responsible. The problem, I think, is that in those key weeks in January and February and March, there were so many segments, there were so many failures by Trump and by Fox, and by others as well. I'm in New York. I got a governor here who gets a lot of criticism. That can't be undone, right? There's no way to roll back the tape or rewind the tape and undo and redo what happened.
Let's get back to the book. I mean, I think quoting you, you said hundreds of people within Fox wanted to talk to you. And I think you referred to some of them as whistleblowers even. So, I mean, what's the climate like in Fox? And hold up your book, Brian. Let's see the cover.
The quote that you reminded me of. Yeah, the climate in Fox. So, I think, again, it goes back to the pandemic. here it is. I had Fox producers and staffers say to me that our coverage in February was hazardous to our viewers. It was dangerous. Like, these were insiders who were saying, you know, that this coverage was outlandish, that this coverage was dangerous. And that's ultimately why I began and ended the book with the pandemic. I obviously had a different beginning in mind, and I was supposed to turn this book in before everything went upside down. But it was clear that this was the best example yet of the Trump-Fox feedback loop. So in this bedroom here, I rewrote the book in April and May and June. And those insiders saying that our coverage was hazardous, it's part of a theme of journalists at Fox saying, we've gone off the rails, that we need stronger leadership, that we need better management, we need standards and practices. This was even coming from some commentators, meaning people that are paid to give you opinions on Fox, not report the news. I think what's happened is there's a tug of war between the news side and the opinion side. And I understand that lots of news outlets have these different sides, right? The Wall Street Journal has an editorial page and a news page. It's just that Fox is so lopsided. So there's a lot more opinion and a lot less news. And the opinion side's a lot stronger. And they're winning the tug of war. And they've moved all the way into propaganda on Trump's behalf, because that's what the audience wants and that's what Trump wants. So these whistleblowers, these insiders, there are a lot of them, from production assistants at the lower levels all the way to anchors and managers at the top, who are concerned about the state of Fox. They are concerned about how much the channel misinforms President Trump, because that's really at the heart of this. And again, I don't think we have any other example like this anywhere else in the world that's quite as complex as right now. The president being fed disinformation from a TV channel that he doesn't own, but that he thinks works for him. And then he pressures that channel to be even more pro-Trump. And it is in the business interest of the Murdochs to do so. It's thorny, I guess, is maybe a word for it. Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it definitely
I think the fascinating thing reading your book was that, we get Trump and Hannity and not Trump and Hannity, sorry, that's a Freudian slip. Tucker Carlson and Hannity in the morning right. Here. But you kind of knew about it, but reading your book, it just was just all these red lights flashing. Not everybody watches Fox News in America. I don't know how many people watch it in Asia. So could you maybe talk us through, from your own knowledge of Fox News, what were the things that really struck you doing your research, speaking to these people in the front lines? What were the real standouts you took away from it?
Yeah, first the point about the ratings, because it is helpful to get this into perspective. Right. Those big shows, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, they get 3 to 5 million viewers every night. And they're not always the same viewers, so over time they're reaching even more people. And Fox's real power comes from its monthly audience, people who see the channel at some point in the month. That's 60 to 70 million Americans in a country of 330. So, it is reaching a huge number of people, even though the audience at any given time is just a sliver of the country. It's reaching a huge number. And then also very importantly, what is said on Sean Hannity's show trickles out to talk radio across the country. It trickles onto the web. It spreads on social media. So Fox is the center of the Republican Party. It's the center of the Trump, kind of the pro-Trump universe. And it has consequences for that reason. I think, when I say pro-Trump universe, I think there's a dialogue happening all everywhere now about this feeling of dueling reality, those alternative realities. How can people be so broken off into alternative realities? And I think the answer really does begin at Fox. It's not the entire answer, because Facebook and Twitter and these other services have a lot to do with it. But this sense of Fox tells a story about America that doesn't sound true to the rest of America. It sounds true to Fox's America, right? It sounds true to Sean Hannity's fans. The story right now about New York City is that New York City is a hellhole, that it's on fire, that it's a disaster, and the crime is dramatically on the rise, and no one would want to live here is sort of the narrative on Fox, which is ironic because the network is based in New York, 10 blocks from me, and most of the anchors are here 10 blocks away. So, okay, that's interesting. But the narrative is that New York is a disaster. That doesn't sound true to New Yorkers. People here know that's not true, but it does sound true to Fox's audience. It feels true to them. They are scared of what's happening in the cities, even though the cities are, we're okay. And so how do you puncture someone's alternative reality? How do you convince them that New York City is not a disaster? How do you convince them that we're going to get through our current challenges just like every other city? That's a struggle. And I think you have to look at the roots of Fox News, the foundation of Fox as a outlet that is supposed to correct the rest of the media, that is supposed to be fair and balanced. In reality, that means unbalanced in favor of the right. And it's constantly telling you as a Fox viewer, don't trust anything else. Don't trust CNN. Don't trust anybody but Trump. That's the message that is conveyed. And I think causes people to be in an echo chamber or an echo prison even. Like it's where you're only hearing what you already believe and what you already think. So what I heard in my reporting for this book was this has become too extreme. Like, I knew when I joined Fox that it was going to be a conservative channel. That's a good thing. There should be diversity of news in America. But we're not right-leaning, one anchor said. We've fallen over. That's really the overarching message. That's the reason why I had to write the book, is there were so many people in the network concerned about what's happened. But I think it matters more broadly because of this alternative realities problem that we have, where Trump can essentially run a re-election campaign on the back of Fox's narratives.
And can you explain again, for people who don't watch Fox, just this immense power that Sean Hannity has amassed, not only in Fox, but with the President of the United States. I mean, and I can't say I felt much sympathy, but people were saying, well, Sean's really tired. He gets all these calls from Trump, morning, noon, and night. It just stresses him out. And so, I mean, who is Sean Hannity? You know Sean Hannity, right?
Yeah, Sean Hannity and I used to be very friendly. He used to be a little bit of a mentor to me, gave me great advice about going to television. Things were simpler in the pre-Trump days. People from Fox and CNN got along more. Go figure. Trump has ruined a lot of relationships, I guess is the way I would put it. But seriously, Hannity was a radio host at a no-name station. He was able to jump to Atlanta and get a bigger show. And then one day, Roger Ailes called him. Roger Ailes thought he looked the part, played the part really well of a Republican blowhard talking head who could dominate a conversation, win an argument with a liberal. So Hannity was cast as this, winner of the conversations and fights with a liberal named Alan Colmes. It's exactly what Fox viewers wanted to see. They wanted to see the Republican win and the Democrat lose every night. And eventually Fox, became more and more right-wing, even more and more conservative. And so they got rid of the liberal. They didn't have the Democrat anymore. It was just Hannity's show. So Hannity's been there for 24 years. He's been doing roughly the same thing every night, which is defending tax cuts and Republican priorities. What's different in the Trump years is he's also an advisor to the president. He's also a confidant, a friend to the president. I think of Trump using Hannity the way that many men rely on their spouses for advice and for feedback and for someone just to vent and talk to. But instead it's Hannity. They sometimes talk before Hannity's show and after Hannity's show. Now, what Sean will always say is, no one knows the truth about my relationship with Donald Trump. Okay, well then Sean, you should tell us. Yes. Because on his show, he rarely talks about this. He rarely discloses the relationship. He will refer to anonymous sources he has, usually the president, but he won't reveal that he's on the phone with the president. So it's a mysterious relationship, but it's a really important one because Hannity is producing Trump's presidency and Trump is programming Hannity's show. And you'd have to ask yourself the question, if Trump didn't have Hannity, if he didn't have Fox News, would his base be there with him? would any other president be at 40% in approval rating polls with all that's happened, with all of these scandals and disasters? Were it not for Hannity every night telling millions of people, don't trust the media, don't believe the news, don't believe the scandals, only trust Trump. That is a propaganda value that is like immeasurable in my view.
Can you, this is of interest out here, obviously. Can you tell us the anecdote that you write about in the book about the night that Trump kept Xi Jinping waiting so he could speak to Sean Hannity?
Right. And this played out on the air where Trump was bragging, saying, I'm having the Chinese president wait until you and I get off the phone. And I figured it was a lie, just like a lot of what Trump says. It's braggadocious, he's exaggerating. But in this case, it was really true. He really did keep the Chinese president waiting. And I reported in the book, according to a White House source, Beijing responded by keeping Trump waiting a little while longer. And the call didn't happen until like 1 a.m. At Washington time. But it does speak to the power dynamic here. Hannity has the power, right? Trump is prioritizing Hannity. Not only that, think about what it's like for Donald Trump. He has to wait his turn to call into Hannity's show. Hannity at 9 p.m. Eastern time on the East Coast, he'll have an interview with the president, but he'll still do his rant first. He'll still do a 20-minute rant first, and then have the president come on the show. It's like when you're the president of the United States and you have this list of world leaders who wants to talk to you, but you're like a caller to a radio or TV show, just like waiting your turn to get on the line. It speaks to the power dynamic or the power imbalance here. And I think when we look back at the Trump years, whether they are 4 or 8 years long, we will say this addiction to television, this reliance on Fox hurt the Trump presidency. It did not help him, it hurt him because he was so often misinformed by the Hannitys of the world. He was never able to grow his base because he was so focused on the issues Fox was covering and not on the issues the rest of America was concerned about.
I mean, that's an interesting point because you talk about propaganda. Fox is a propaganda outlet for Trump, and a lot of people say that, but it's not your normal propaganda outlet. I mean, Vladimir Putin doesn't take his cue from what RT says or what Sputnik says. This is a different dynamic. I mean, there was the example, I think, last week with the racial diversity program.
Oh,
which
it's a great example.
is like,
yeah.
Is that, could you explain that? How? I mean,
This is
Okay.
This is a great 30-second example of how loopy the Fox-Trump feedback loop is. America's going through an overdue reckoning on race. A lot of white Americans are trying to figure out what they need to know about what has gone wrong in this country. We talk about white privilege, white fragility. There's an academic line of thought called critical race theory that says racism is systemic, it's endemic to America. We have to view it through that lens. So this is something that's popular in academia. These books, these anti-racism books are flying off the shelves. Publishers cannot keep them in print. And this is scary to Trump. This is scary to right-wing media. They don't want this to be the dominant conversation. And so all summer long, there's been this narrative in right-wing pro-Trump media, mostly on websites like Breitbart, that white privilege training is a threat, that federal agencies are doing these training sessions to help employees be more racially sensitive. And that is a bad thing. That is a threat. That is anti-American. Trump says it's properly un-American. So this gets talked about on Breitbart, other right-wing websites. It gets on the Laura Ingraham show. Tucker Carlson promotes it last Tuesday. He brings on a guest to talk about it. By Thursday, the federal government's telling Fox News they're going to take action. By Friday, one of Trump's aides says, we are banning all white privilege training, no more race training sessions anywhere in the federal government. And by Saturday, Trump is tweeting people saying, yay, whiteness wins. And it's not the literal quote, but there was a racial line to his tweets where he was celebrating this action he's taking to make sure people don't get bad ideas in their head about the history of whiteness in America. So it all came from Fox. I mean, it all came from Fox. And this is just a really clear example of how the priorities set by the TV shows are the priorities of the Trump White House.
Yeah, goes way beyond propaganda. I mean, I think in the book you say there were more than 20 ex-Fox staffers working the White House. or in the administration. I mean, how's that articulated? I mean, do they talk to each other? I mean, is this a Fox? I mean, I think you said, a comedian said that Trump always wanted a TV station. Now it's the Fox is taking over the White House. So what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, the revolving door has swung in multiple directions, and to be fair, it has swung in past administrations as well. The ex-editor of Time magazine became Obama's press secretary, and now runs PR at Amazon. So, there's always been this door. It just swings faster in the Trump years because Trump explicitly will see someone on Fox and say, I want to hire that person, or I want that person on the phone for advice. He has literally hired people like Morgan Ortagus, the State Department spokesperson, based on her appearances as a Fox employee. So, in fact, one of his aides, Hope Hicks, his trusted campaign aide, joined him in the White House, then went to Fox Corporation. Now she's back at the White House. So people have sometimes done 360-degree full spin through this door. It is, I think, a manifestation of Trump TV come to life. If Trump, can't have his own network, he can have as close to the thing as possible through Fox and by hiring personalities from Fox. And, with that great power comes a lot of responsibility. And the core problem and the core thesis of Hoax is no one is being responsible with that power. So, Fox and Friends, the morning show, it's on from 6 to 9 a.m. New York time. Fox and Friends is the president's Bible. He treats it like his daily briefing. But they're putting a lot of garbage on that show that's not been fact-checked or vetted. So the president gets misinformed by Fox and Friends, and then he misinforms the rest of the country. And there's not an accountability, or there's not a follow-through on the part of Fox to say, why did that mistake get on the air? The president has now been screwed up by this. Who let this happen? There's not that kind of follow-up, and that's the problem at the heart of Trump TV.
Reading your book, there seems to be quite a lot of nostalgia in Fox about Roger Ailes.
Yes.
But is that not wrong, inherently wrong, given the fact he was such a sexual predator and the network had such a deep-rooted culture of sexism and sexual harassment? It's almost like when people say, give me the dictator back because, there was, how can you explain that?
It is exactly related to what you just said. This was uncomfortable for me to write about because I hate to say it, that people miss Roger Ailes at Fox News, but they do. There's a cafe downstairs in my building. I sat with producers from Fox who told me about why they thought Roger Ailes would have run the network more effectively in the Trump years. Look, this is all hypothetical. Roger Ailes died in May of 2017. But Trump himself has said he doesn't think he may not have been elected were not for Ailes. Ailes, however, was tough on Trump sometimes. He knew how to rein Trump in when necessary. When Trump would attack stars like Megyn Kelly on Fox, Ailes would put out statements denouncing Trump, attacking Trump for it, basically trying to punish him. So the view at Fox is, I think there's different views, but I think one popular view at Fox is, if Ailes were in charge, there'd be a strong leader. At least someone would be firmly in charge and would have tried to control Trump in a way that no one at Fox does today. And it does. It gets this idea of dictatorship, right? Like the television news needs to be run by a dictator. And at least Ailes, everyone knew who the boss was. That was the view there, even though he was also abusing his power. I had somebody at Fox say to me, the network's always been programmed for an audience of one, and it was Roger Ailes. Everybody knew what the boss wanted. When Ailes was forced out, once his abuse was exposed and he was forced out by the Murdochs, the network was still produced for an audience of one, but it was Donald Trump instead. So in that idea, Trump filled a leadership vacuum and gradually took control of the network, not in a literal way, he's not making decisions, but in a way that everybody wants to please Trump world, make Trump happy. Like if you produce a really Trumpy show and you cover Trump topics, he might call in. You're going to get more viewers. You're going to get more attention. You're going to get a bigger promotion, a fatter contract. That's the incentive structure that we've seen. And that's why I say it's state-supported TV. And it's also a TV-supported state. Obviously not state-run, but state-supported, because most of Trump's interviews on national TV go to Fox, and mostly to the opinion people, not the news people. They practically have daily access to White House officials. So at times when the White House is not holding press briefings, they'll be on Fox instead. So it would seem like Fox has all those benefits of being state-supported TV.
And where do the Murdochs fit into this? I mean, reading the book, I get the impression Lachlan and Rupert on one side, and James is portrayed as the kind of good guy, as it were, who had to walk away with his, I think, $2 billion, was it? So, I mean, is this purely a money-making exercise for Lachlan and Rupert Murdoch, or is it ideological as well?
I think it is primarily about the profits. Fox News is a profit machine. It's on a path to make $2 billion a year. That's an astonishing sum for a cable channel. Other cable operators would do anything for that kind of profit machine. So I think the interests of Rupert and Lachlan are in the business, not in the editorial. Rupert, although to some extent is interested in the editorial because he does use the channel to push his priorities, and does have a strong relationship with Trump, a very cozy relationship with Trump. But Lachlan, his son, is not interested in that. Lachlan is the CEO of the company. He's focused on the business. He wants to grow Fox Corporation. James, the other son, is definitely more liberal. He promoted Pete Buttigieg in the Democratic primaries. He and his wife, Catherine, are disgusted by what is airing on Fox News. They hate what has happened to Fox. They think Sean Hannity is doing so much damage to the country. And on a not unrelated note, James has kind of left the family empire. He's left the Fox board. He's left the News Corporation board in recent months. But he is still, as you mentioned, he made $2 billion off the Fox sale to Disney, the partial sale at Disney, and he is still in the family trust. So who knows what'll happen in the event of Rupert Murdoch's death when there are 4 votes in the trust, 4 children, 1 vote each. We know that Lachlan runs the company, so I think we know how he would vote. But if the other 3 children tried to take control away from Lachlan, there very well could be a battle for the soul of Fox. And in that scenario, let's just play that out one step further. If James and his sisters have control of Fox Corporation, they could then try to make changes at Fox News to pull the channel back from the propagandists and back from the hardcore right-wing content and all the conspiracy theories, and try to enforce more of an editorial vision. But again, this is so, now we are like 5 steps down the road, and who knows if we'll ever get that far down the road.
Sure. Let's talk about CNN. I mean, I've seen Fox and Friends, and we get the 12-hour difference. So I waken up every morning, and we have Anderson Cooper, Chris Cuomo, and Don Lemon, who are great. But I mean, wouldn't a Trump supporter say the same things about them as others would say about Fox and Friends? I mean, to a Trump supporter, aren't they the CNN equivalent, liberal, biased, partisan? What do you say to that?
I would say that CNN and NBC and ABC and the New York Times and all these, established American news brands are tethered to the truth in a way that opinion shows on Fox are not.
Right.
In terms of vetting and standards and practices. And the best example I can give you is about CNN and about what it takes to get a taped package on the air. One of our like correspondent packages that are pre-produced, that are pre-taped. I had one on my show on Sunday. We worked on it for 3 days, had at least 5 different people's eyes on the piece, making changes and improvements. Had to be approved by 3 different parts of CNN. And sometimes, to be honest, that process can be frustrating. I think any journalist listening can relate. There are times where you feel like the standards process slows you down, asks questions that don't need to be asked. But the reality is that process is a good thing for all of us. It is protecting us from ourselves. And Fox doesn't have that process. I think that's one of the biggest differences journalistically. They don't have a standards and practices process for pieces that are on the air. One show does, actually, this is interesting. One Fox show does. It is Brett Baer's show, which airs at 6 a.m. your time, 6 p.m. Eastern time in the US. It's their evening newscast. Rupert likes it. He calls it the news. But the only reason they have that process is because the anchor, Bret Baier, wants to have it. Otherwise, it doesn't exist at Fox. And so I think that right there is the difference. It's that lack of vetting and review and approval that, again, sometimes annoys me, right? It annoys people, but it is there for our own safety. And it doesn't exist at Fox. So they will yank a story from Politico. They'll put a flashy banner on screen about it. They won't even credit Politico. And they'll yak about it on TV, as opposed to go out and do the reporting themselves. That is the stereotypical Fox and Friends or Hannity segment. And because there's not that standards and practices, I think that's the difference. Obviously, we make mistakes at CNN. I make mistakes, every once in a while. I have to have a tough conversation with my bosses. That's a good thing. It makes me stronger. It makes me work harder and more carefully and better. And at Fox, there's not that accountability when things go wrong. So a producer at Fox and Friends said to me, once in a while, when there is a scandal about something that was on the air that was totally made up or foolish, they'll come down to us and they'll say, stop screwing up. But what they really mean is stop getting caught. There's that sense within the ranks that there's not accountability for wrongdoing. There's just a desire not to be noticed doing it. But it's hard not to be noticed when the president is tweeting verbatim the banners that are on screen. And look, I think ultimately this story is about the president and why he's addicted to Fox, just like millions of viewers. Ultimately, he gets misinformed by the content, and that's why the content matters.
Just kind of following on from that, similar topic, I got a question from Joshua Zimmerman, who says, the only real difference I see between Fox and CNN coverage is that Fox's biases are part of its brand, while CNN somehow still purports to be balanced and objective. But I don't know if you may have just answered that.
Well, I think with the CNN, we talk about Trump constantly, right? We are in constant Trump coverage mode. And I get complaints about that sometimes from viewers. Viewers will say that, we are too harsh and too critical and too tough on the president. And my reaction to that is, if Joe Biden becomes president and says millions of people voted illegally, I won't have any hair left. Like if Joe Biden comes into office and says that, that it's rainy, that it's sunny at his inauguration when it's raining, which literally happened. Trump got the weather. He lied about the weather on day one. Like, we will fact check him to the ends of the earth. It will be so shocking for any politician to lie the way Trump has. I actually think the coverage will be harsher. Like, I actually think news at American outlets go easy on Trump relative to how many lies he utters, including during this hour on his Twitter feed as we're talking. He makes up so much and gets so many things wrong that the coverage actually is not as critical as it would be in any other scenario. So I get that, that our coverage comes across as tough, but I think we have to stay steady with regards to being fact-checking, standing up for facts, and also decency, and also democracy. Because those are not partisan principles. These are not partisan, at least I don't think they should be considered, and my colleagues don't think they should be considered partisan ideals. When there's this growing intolerance and indecency in American life, this acceptance of vulgarity and coarseness and meanness, just nastiness to our fellow man, I'm glad that anchors like Jake Tapper and Anderson Cooper stand up against that. I don't think that's partisan. Sorry for the long answer.
Okay. You played a recording, I think it was a call on reliable sources, a death threat against you and Don Lemon. Some guy said he was going to shoot you. There were pipe bombs sent to CNN. You've been branded an enemy of the people by the President of the United States. I know that you engaged with some of the online insults that you received. How do you deal with this? You're obviously in the firing line. I mean, do you feel threatened? I mean, what's the general feeling with yourself and within your other colleagues in CNN?
Yeah, it's a big change from 4 years ago. I never thought I'd have to have a bodyguard to go to a campaign event.
Right.
And sadly, this is true across the media. You know, Sean Hannity gets a lot of threats, and that's appalling. Other Fox stars get a lot of hate mail and threats, and that's appalling. Again, I think that's about setting up for decency and trying to lower the temperature. Let's not try to raise the temperature, let's try to lower the temperature. Do I feel threatened at any given time? No, but there are flare-ups. There are certain incidents that are worrisome, and CNN has been really supportive about that. And I did go to a Trump rally with a bodyguard in 2018. I wrote about that in Hoax.
Sure.
That's basically the standard practice now when Trump's having big rallies, because you really just want to have somebody to keep an eye on the crowd for you. What I found I didn't like that I had to go there with bodyguard, but I actually ended up being grateful, because it wasn't like I was in danger at all, but I could relax and be myself and talk with rally goers and talk with attendees, because I knew somebody else was watching out for me to make sure it didn't get hairy. So that was definitely useful. The death threat that aired live on C-SPAN was really interesting, because it speaks to how so many people have been poisoned with disinformation. This guy called into C-SPAN and said, Brian Stelter thinks all Trump supporters are racists. He says all Trump supporters are racist. Well, obviously I've never said that. Why would I say that? How would I back that up? I have said that clearly racial resentment was a factor. That's been proven through numerous research studies and papers. Clearly racial resentment was a factor, but not all Trump supporters are racist. So where's he getting that crazy idea from? Who put that in his head? Well, Sean Hannity's show the night before had run a 2-year-old clip of me talking about Trump and racism. 2-year-old clip. Just happened to run it just for fun the night before. And then this guy calls into C-SPAN. Now, I don't know if those are linked. I think they might be connected, but I don't know for sure, right? But my point is, you've got this hate machine. And I acknowledge this is the problem on the left sometimes too, but there's this hate machine on the right using old clips, Sean Hannity show telling you who to hate on any given day. And some people believe it. And that's why we have to stand up for decency and democracy, and stand up against this nonsense. I do think that it's worth viewing the president's attacks on the media as a hate movement. He is urging his followers to not just think the press is biased, which that's a critique we can talk about. He's urging people to hate the news media. And that's going to have long-lasting consequences. I don't know what they're going to be, but I know that that's not going to fade away on the day he leaves the White House.
So let's talk about sources. You have a show called Reliable Sources. You interviewed Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, about the story about Trump and the military, which was based on anonymous sources. What do you think about that? I mean, do you believe that story?
I liked the way that Goldberg said it to me about having to decide when to grant anonymity. He said, does the public's right to know or need to know something outweigh the morally complicated and ambiguous qualities of anonymous sourcing? And that does make sense to me as a rubric. Having to give anonymity, is it worth it for the public's right to know or need to know versus the obvious downsides of giving anonymity? I think here's the reality about his story. Bob Woodward's book comes out in a week. Woodward may well have the same information or even worse information. Jeffrey Goldberg clearly has a relationship with Jim Mattis, clearly has a relationship with John Kelly. We can see that based on his interviews in the past. It does not take a rocket scientist to figure out where this stuff is coming from. So that's what makes me partly feel confident in his reporting. I also feel confident in it because CNN and Fox have have corroborated parts of it. And it's in line with the president's public actions. It's in line with his behavior. And I think, look, a lot of people, every time I'm on CNN talking about this, some anchor says to me, they say, will it matter? Will anybody change their minds? And the answer is probably not. I should probably be more honest and just say no when the anchor asks me the question. But the stories still matter because we need to have the fullest public view of each of the candidates for president. So let's fill in the portrait as much as we can. Let's know everything we can about Biden and Trump. And that's to the benefit of the public, even if it doesn't change anyone's mind.
Your book obviously has a lot of anonymous sources as well. So why should people believe your sources?
Yeah.
Why
I
should
think
people believe Brian Stelter's sources?
Yeah, that's right. Well, look, so that's actually why I start the book in a way that's a little bit unusual. I wasn't comfortable doing this at first, but my editor pushed me to do it, and I think she was right. I told my own story. I basically said, here's who I am, here's where I'm coming from, in a very first-person way that I never did for my first book about morning television. And the reason I did that was to say to the readers, I've been covering Fox for 16 years. Here's proof of my friendship with Hannity. Here's proof of my friendship with Tucker Carlson in the past. Here's proof that all these executives and readers and people were paying, have known me for 16 years. Here's how I've grown up in the business. Here's where I've worked. Basically just to tell everybody my story so they understand me and my credibility and thus can determine if they trust the people I trust. I think the other reasons are, number one, you try to describe the sources as carefully as you can. So don't just call them a staffer, call them an anchor, call them a producer. And then I think most importantly, one of the reveals I have at the end of the book is this staffer who goes on the record with me while still working there, which is very, very unusual. I mean, I've never had that happen before in the media business. People are very afraid for their jobs. They don't want to lose their jobs. They insist on anonymity. Even at CNN, you have that phenomenon. But this researcher reaches out to me named Sean Graff. He writes to me and says, I'm so disturbed by what's happening at my company. I work in New York. I verified that he really worked there. He says, Fox's allegiance with President Trump is a risk to our democracy. He says, many of my colleagues agree. So basically, when you have people on the record saying all the same things you've been hearing for 2 years, I think that hopefully buttresses the credibility as well. But I think we need to do a much better job of explaining sourcing. Honestly, I wish I had written more about this in the book. I wish I had devoted a couple of pages to this issue rather than just a paragraph to these calculations that have to be made and why they're made.
What are CNN's rules on anonymous sourcing?
Roughly the same. If I'm going to go on with something sensational or groundbreaking, there's going to be multiple sources. And they are going to be vetted by my bosses. This is one of those things we should tell the audience more often, which we all know here, which is the sources are not anonymous to me. It's what I got Goldberg to say on Sunday. So even for something as small as a newsletter item, I write a nightly newsletter for CNN. Even for something as small as a newsletter item that's going to be quoting an insider, I call my editor, I tell him the source, we talk about it, we talk about whether there's any other way to include it without saying insider, and then we go ahead with it. And I think the more important the news, the more the more eyes and more people are involved. Right? So yeah.
I have a question from Mark Mickelson. Do you think your book can and will make a difference to Fox? Do you think the issues you raise, will it make a difference?
That's interesting. I think it has drawn attention to what's really going on at Fox, and that's a good thing. I guess I'm hesitating because what does it mean to make a difference, right? Is it gonna change any viewer's mind? Well, I don't know if that was my goal. It's gonna change a voter's mind. I don't know if that was my goal either. My goal is to try to tell what's happened between Trump and Fox and have people understand just how cozy this relationship is and how it's affected Trump's presidency. And based on the reviews and the feedback, I think I've helped do that a little bit. But I'm of the view that we are all pushing a rock up a very big hill, and we're all just pushing, inch by inch or millimeter by millimeter, centimeter by, we're all just, we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves in this journalism world. So yeah, I don't know how much it'll matter. I did wonder if there would be, would Fox come out and deny specifics, and they have not? Would Hannity come out and deny things? They have not. That's because I did fact check a ton. I was very careful. I don't think anybody at Fox was surprised by what I wrote. And that's always my goal as a reporter. I don't want people to be surprised. I think it matters because I think there's hundreds of books about Trump. And a lot of them have told a pretty similar story. And, like I said earlier, I think most Americans see through a lot of the nonsense, a lot of the fog. So I think the daily coverage, the weekly shows, the books, I do think they make a difference in terms of people's understanding of the Trump age in general, yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes left, Brian. I have a question from Angel Kwan, a reporter at the Apple Daily here. I don't know how closely you've been following what's been happening in Hong Kong. I mean, the founder and owner of the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, was arrested recently. There were about 150, 200 policemen went into the offices. Have you been following? What's your feeling observing Hong Kong from afar about what's happening here on the press freedom front?
Well, emphasis on the word afar. I feel like I don't have the best view because I am not there, but I'm there in spirit, and I'm glad that when the paper was raided, the photographers and reporters were there so the world could see it. I think that's all we can do in Washington or Hong Kong. Show these restrictions, show viewers and readers why they matter, and teach people what the consequences are. So I just, I thought that when these Australian reporters returned to Australia today, the fact that they talked about why, they were transparent about it, they were open about it, that's all we can ask for, all we can hope for.
Okay, thanks. And I have a message from Christy Lou Stout, who sent you hugs.
She helped set this up today, thank you.
And she has a question. How will Fox News cover election night 2020? Which face of Fox News will be more dominant? The opinion side, Hannity Carlson, or the more fact-based side of the organization? What do you expect?
Well, this is so interesting. This is probably going to be the key to the American election. I really think it is. So Fox News says its news anchors lead election nights. That was true in 2016. It'll be true this year. It'll be Brett Baer and Martha McCallum and Chris Wallace, and it'll be their news side stars. And Fox has a really strong, really well-respected decision desk that analyzes the data and calls races. They are the ones that called it for Trump. They're the ones that called it for Obama. These are great men and women, really well-respected. I don't think there's any funny business there. I think where Fox has a huge responsibility is in the hours after election night, assuming there's not a winner right away, or even if there is a call right away. What will Tucker and Sean, what will Fox and Friends, what will they say? Will this be a house divided where the news side is saying the votes are still being counted, and the Trump side is saying Trump won, shut it down, stop the counting, Trump won? Will we be in this situation where there are two contradictory, confusing messages coming from the two sides of the house? Because we know what side of the house is more popular. It's the propaganda side. We know what side is more trusted by Fox viewers. They trust the opinion people. They don't trust the news anchors as much. They trust the opinion shows are so much more popular than the news shows. In that situation, the Murdochs and the head of Fox News have a huge responsibility, and I hope they live up to it. I hope they prioritize news and not lies. I hope they prioritize news and not spin. I don't know what they'll do. I don't know how. That's going to be a huge, huge question because people trust the results of American elections because the news anchors announce the results. We don't have an electoral college until December, so there's not actually a certification of the vote until almost New Year's. But the country, by and large, accepts the result because television networks announce it. And if Sean Hannity and those guys at Fox on the opinion side decide to contest it or go along with whatever Trump is tweeting, it's going to do enormous damage. So this will be interesting. I mean, look, in 2018, Hannity wasn't even on Fox's election coverage once. He didn't even call in. So we'll see what happens this year. And by the way, to Chris's question, I think we have to keep pointing out this situation ahead of time because the Murdochs have to be held, there's responsibility here. We have to say their names. They are the ones that own the channel that ultimately will be responsible.
Great. Fantastic, Brian. So one last question. As the author of a best-selling book, and this is a question we ask all our guests now, what's your summer reading? Or it's going to be autumn reading. I think it might be autumn reading. But what are you reading right now?
I'm reading Reed Hastings' book. It actually came out today. It's called No Rules, Rules, about the culture of Netflix. And then I'm hoping that Bob Woodward's book shows up here before release day. They you know the way the publishers do it is they get a list of all the reporters they want to send early copies to, and then it just magically shows up at your door when you're not expecting it. So I'm really hoping I'm on the list, but I don't know if I am for Woodward's book. But I do think starting tomorrow, that's going to be the big Trump story. Whatever's in that book is going to drive the news. We'll see what it is.
Great. Well, thanks again. We'll be following reliable sources, but following
Thank
your
you so much
daily
for having
updates.
me. Thank you for talking with me about Hoax.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.